Hello there, Turing Podcast listener. If I could just borrow your ear a moment. My name's Jonah, a content producer here at the Turing.
And I'm Smera Jayadeva, a research assistant in Data Justice and Global Ethical Futures.
Together, we present Too Long Didn't Read, a weekly podcast brought to you by the Alan Turing Institute. We read the big AI stories so you don't have to.
Each week, we'll be your trusted guides through the rapidly evolving landscape of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data analysis.
Reading beyond the headlines to explore the history, evolution, regulation, and cultural impact of AI on our world and the people in it.
Whether you're a seasoned pro or just AI curious, we've got you covered.
Find Too Long Didn't Read wherever you get your podcasts.
Too Long Didn't Read, out now.
We are taking you behind the scenes of the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence.
With unprecedented access to the scientists pushing boundaries and shaping our future, this show will take you to the cutting edge and beyond.
And whether you're an expert yourself or just science curious, this is the show for you.
Welcome to the Turing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Turing Podcast. I'm Ed and I'm here with B. Hi B.
Hello.
And today we're chatting with Cari Hyde-Vaamonde, who is a PhD candidate at King's College London and visiting lecturer in law, who teaches on the Master's course for Law and Technology. Cari was also recently on the Alan Turing Institute's enrichment scheme for PhDs. Cari, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just to get started. Do you want to just tell us a bit about yourself, your background, how you came to be working at the Alan Turing Institute and your sort of journey here?
I've been a practicing lawyer for a number of years. I did a law degree and then trained as a barrister, has always been in court. That was my sort of, the world of my practice was going into court. And during that time, I was at some point a legal counsel for a technology company. So I suppose up to a certain point, I'd been immersed in the world of court, but also aware of, this the interaction basically between law and technology. And through experience in court, I thought that there was something going on in that interaction in court that suggested that there was something more than just the outcome that was important. Basically, I chose to move into academic research and started the PhD at King's, which has then led into my research.
Nice. And so has it been sort of throughout your career as a lawyer and stuff, you've noticed the sort of, growing use of just technology in general? Like, what was the first thing that, if you go into law, maybe a lot of people who study law don't imagine they're going to end up working in sort of computer science or anything like that. So what was the sort of first thing that got you interested, the first sort of thing that, really made you think you were going to go down that path?
Well, I was always aware of programming and things like that because my brothers were very much into programming, and I was also very torn before I started my degree whether I would do law or physics, for example. So I was always very interested in
quite
maths
different.
And so I kind of had to set that aside for a lot of years and just have it in the background as something I was really interested in, but not really. I couldn't see a path where these two sides of my personality, essentially, or my interests, could be combined.
It's nice that it was your interest as well. I think typically the sort of like there's a push from some families to be like, oh, you got to be a doctor or a lawyer. But if you're saying lawyer or physicist, it sounds like that was more your own personal interest.
You're going to be both, right? A lawyer and a PhD, so technically a doctor and a lawyer at this point.
That's true. Yeah, that's good. I had thought of that.
It wasn't. I wasn't under pressure. It was my free choice. But speaking to my brother, was quite a bit older than me, and he was sort of in maths, and he sort of said, well, you're able to do stuff with English that maybe we're not sure about, and you can use your logic in law, so do that basically. And he convinced me to try something different, no regrets, but very happy now that I'm able to bring these things together.
So speaking of bringing things together, I guess there's something, there's a field called algorithmic justice, which sounds like it's both of those things combined. So is this a new field? Is there a lot of research being done? And can you tell us a little bit more about what this is?
Yeah, I mean, people have been talking about the use of AI or algorithms within justice for many years. Yeah, but what's happened now is, of course, we're starting to be able to actually do the things that we've been theoretically thinking about for a very long time. And so, it could come down to, there's various ways in which you can do that, but it's about automating processes, essentially. That can happen in policing, or it can happen in the courtroom. When you're automating something, you're taking away the kind of discretionary element, maybe that's normally injected by a human being. But it can seem positive because what are laws? They're rules, and rules are things that can be potentially applied, mechanically. So I suppose that's very broadly where you might be thinking. It could. Other ways in which we look at it is a statistical analysis of what risk factors are in, for example, deciding if someone's likely to reoffend. So there's this kind of broad range of things which you could class under the idea of algorithmic justice, but essentially it is that bringing in of automation or algorithms, AI, into that process.
I guess someone who is naive both about law and about computer programs and AI in general might think, well, the law is just a set of rules, and if computer programming is just, programming some rules, it should be possible to program a computer program or an AI in quotation marks that just sort of like interprets data and can make a decision based on the law. But somehow I suspect it's a little bit more messy than that.
Yeah, I think that I'm always, in my research and when I speak about these things, trying to advocate for nuance. So it's not a clear-cut answer. It's not 100% wrong and it's not 100% right, in the sense that, law is a series of rules. And there is a whole movement for the, rules as code, where the idea is that we can take kind of legislation, the sort of primary piece of law from the government to say, right, okay, these are the rules, and actually put them, instead of simply writing the law and then kind of translating it into, I don't know, a program that distributes social security payments, for example, doing these two things in tandem, developing the law and the code at the same time as you're legislating. So I suppose there is that argument that can be done. But I think that you're right when you say there are a lot of, it's not clear cut. I think what we need to do before we think, well, can we just put these rules into code, ask ourselves, what are we expecting from the justice system in itself? Because law is not just these rules, of course, but it's that kind of interaction between the public and the state. It's bound up with all these things about whether we consent to the rules that are made about us, whether we consent to adhere to those rules. So it's really important that if we're going to talk about, as we often do, reforming the justice system, to bring in algorithms that can facilitate this, that we question what is our aim in doing so, and what we're trying to achieve when we do that.
I guess I was gonna ask is just if we also do it somehow in a blind way, we risk, I would imagine, propagating what already are systemic problems, right? Because the law, unfortunately, there are still a lot of problems with it that actually favors some people in regards to other people, etc. So I would imagine that having algorithms learn from this would also not be necessarily good in terms of for everyone, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're using historical data to feed into these things, well, we know that certain groups are policed more heavily than others, and a certain therefore they're going to that is reflected then in the courtroom as well. And these statistical kind of, you could call them biases. Obviously, it's a bias in the data, which has actually been produced by humans in the first place. But those biases then can be amplified, because if we're going to just simply apply that and say, well, we're therefore, if we're talking about algorithmic use in policing, we're going to say, right, okay, well, this area is more likely to be a source of where there's crime. Then, of course, you're going to have this self-fulfilling kind of notion, because more resources will be piled in there. You're more likely to find, inverted commas, criminals in that sense. So there is that risk of biases. And so therefore, when we're looking at what we're trying to achieve with law and algorithmic justice, then we have to think very carefully about exactly what tools we're using and what we're trying to achieve with those tools. I often say that there's, in the case of, if you, and I'm not a medical science data expert, okay, but I know that if you biopsy, a piece of skin, and you find that there's a tumor there, you can verify that there's a truth there, that there is a tumor. You cannot do the same with law. You can't be sure that you have guilt in many circumstances. So when you're trying to learn from this data, there's that added complexity that's within the legal sphere that's not necessarily present in other areas.
That the ground truth is not necessarily binary, basically.
Yeah, and it will be, and when you think about the whole mechanism of justice as it is at the moment, prior to the use or the extensive use of algorithms, it's a lot of this truth finding, but there's also the performative nature of justice, and we need to understand what's going on in there, what functions are being fulfilled in that process that we may not ever had to question before as whether we need to have them or not.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess, for those of us who don't know much about law, it makes sense. Judges do the judging of evidence, right? They make decisions based on the evidence, but you don't ever know what actually happened. And I mean, obviously you might have video footage and so on, but that's still a kind of evidence, right? You can be doctored nowadays, so it's all a judgment call. And just going back to what I was saying at the start, so that a naive person might think, oh well, the law is just a set of rules, but it still comes down to people choosing how they interpret those rules and how they sort of weight different evidence in terms of making a decision. And what you're suggesting is that there's now a push towards using AI, perhaps using machine learning to automate some of these processes, and obviously that's going to be learning by some kind of input data, which might be the judge's past decisions. So could you tell us a bit, I'll ask you a bit about your own research in a moment, about which I think is more based on modelling the decision-making process itself. But when it comes to what people are trying to do in terms of is it that people want to sort of speed up the number of cases that can be done in a day? What are the sorts of tasks that people interested in the sort of intersection of technology and law are interested in improving?
Okay, yeah. So I think I should say at the outset that I don't want to over-egg where we are at the moment in terms of using machine learning to decide cases, at least here in the UK. But that's not what I'm saying, that we're not on that brink necessarily at the moment. But I think that as researchers, as people interested in the reform of the justice system and improving justice more generally, it's really important to look at all the tools that are available. So, machine learning has to be looked at, other tools have to be looked at to be able to establish this. And of course, we've got a serious issue with delay in the justice system. And even if we didn't, it would be strange if we weren't looking as to whether we could speed up justice, because every day that passes, a witness's memory fades. Individuals involved, whether they're witnesses, victims, the accused, they're all affected by every day that passes in terms of a case, and that's also true in civil law in a sort of different sense. So yes, absolutely. One of the things one would be looking at is trying to speed up justice, try to make sure that justice is done quickly, and that it's done in a cost-effective way, because of course there's limited resources for the state. You can't just put all the money into justice. Other things like medicine, etc., require funds. So there's an interest in limiting cost. But if we think of that term efficiency, it's what is expended per, I should get the dictionary definition, but essentially it's, per unit of cost, what are we aiming for? And again, my statement is that essentially we're looking at, understanding what people want to obtain when they look at justice, and it can't simply be throughput. It can't simply be the number of cases that go through, and not even necessarily the outcome. And that's something that we're looking at as well. Is it necessarily, correct or not correct from my personal point of view? That's not necessarily the thing.
I mean, it's easy to imagine a perverse way this could go wrong. For those of us who think about AI, if you design a machine learning algorithm which its goal is to optimize the number of cases seen, or then it's going to do a bad job but do it quickly. Or if it's going to optimize the number of convictions, well, that's also not going to be very good, because it's going to just convict people however it can.
But I guess there's other stages. Like, for example, I guess large language models can, for example, help with the bureaucratic part, not on the decision, but actually writing up all of these legal documents that have a structure, and you have to write them a certain way. So if you have a model that actually helps you write, like how everyone uses large language models now to write emails, right? That could be like helping with the bottleneck, for example. That
are you using ChatGPT to write your emails, B?
I am not. I make no comments. I neither confirm nor deny. But it's, you know what I mean? Like, this can be the type of thing that it's not necessarily, I guess, AI just for deciding and for the justice part, but actually to help with the cost of the human cost of time cost of having to go through, because I imagine you have a lot of bureaucracies that you have to get through, right? So if you can, instead of having to write everything by hand, and I'm using a quotation hands that you cannot see, listeners, but I guess this can be something that can help, right, in a more
absolutely. And there's lots of businesses looking at how one can use the technology to, for example, go through large numbers of documents, obtain, look at where something relevant might be and pull it out. There have, not in the UK, been examples of writing of judgments by one of these large language models, or generative AI, but that does throw up again a question of what we're trying to achieve with justice, I think. And so yes, there's a massive possibility for the use of these tools, but always with a mind to, are we, let's just check we're not losing something that's actually important, for example, to the public in the justice process as we're doing it. And that just requires constant vigilance and also an understanding of the models that we're using.
So maybe this is a good segue to, could you tell us a bit about your own work in modelling decision-making processes of judges, magistrates who are working on traffic offences?
Yeah, so I wanted to really explore how the process of justice could be done through the use of an algorithm, or, using these... using the technology that was available, essentially. And I didn't want to necessarily go from historical data from the reasons that we've discussed. So I did a sort of a scope of the area of law, and have been working with Pier Paolo Vibo in King's College London, who's a physicist and obviously in computer science as well, to create a model that would allow you to decide a very basic traffic offence of, for example, not stopping at a red light when you should stop. Okay, and that's possible because we're not in that kind of case. You wouldn't necessarily be looking at verbal evidence. You'd be having a kind of textual input, really text input. So it's possible to do that quite easily by looking at the language used and things like that. And the process is really, although there is some of it that's directed towards deciding the offence, the main thing is that we're deciding, mitigating and aggravating factors, and that's it's a fairly simple algorithm. I wouldn't say that it's highly complex, but it's it's a way of probing how this could work. And then the main sort of thinking behind it is I'm also then showing that to participants in the research, showing them, visualizing how these decisions could be made, and then trying to record from them their response to that, because I want to try and understand where are the limits and why are there limits in terms of people thinking about using algorithms for judicial decision making.
Why did this leads well into the next question, which is why is it important to consider people's input and their feeling towards this technology?
It really goes to something that I was talking about, I think, a little bit at the beginning, which is, that there's this relationship between the people and the state. Okay, and when you have, it's an understanding of how law functions to kind of connect and obtain the consent of people for that kind of power relationship, essentially, because that's what it is. Because the criminal law allows us to remove people's liberty, or otherwise penalize them for what
in this case their driving license, I guess.
Yeah, you may remove their driving license, put on penalty points, but there's also a kind of societal burden that they may feel, that they've been told they're criminal in some way, and it has that impact. Okay, so but what's important is that people must feel that the justice system is legitimate, that the police, that the judges operating within it are legitimate in the way in which they proceed, and that's based on research that's been done quite extensively. Looking at how justice is done and the procedures through which justice is done. So even if we're not, looking at it from a rights kind of idea where we're thinking, human beings need to be treated in a certain way, that's absolutely an important way of looking at it. But if we're looking at it from the perspective of, we want basically, the system to work for people to, be safe and be in a society where there's laws that people abide by, we need people to trust that system. And if we undermine that trust through by not going through procedures that people see as, supporting it and fair, etc., that can have really extreme results. And just, for example, people not wanting to be witnesses, they'll, withdraw from processes. So it's having that understanding about that law. It's not just merely a case of saying, right, here's a new law, you're just going to abide by it. There's a process going on there where people are, learning, to, living within those bounds almost voluntarily and giving consent.
It's easy for me to imagine a scenario where you've been given some kind of punishment for a traffic offence. Say you've, driven into a yellow jagged box or whatever it is, and by some automated means you've been given a fine or something. It sort of feels like it's much more difficult to appeal, perhaps. And, is this the kind of things you're thinking about when you're, talking to, as part of the research, interviewing people about how they feel about these decision-making processes?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the examples that I use in my research is someone has gone through the red light because there's an emergency vehicle, and how do people respond to that?
Yeah.
But it's an interesting case because if it is just merely an ambulance that they've seen, it's still an offence, and it's still, there's some complexities to the law around it. But I think that what we're looking at is, even in what you might think, oh, well, it's just traffic offence, people are it's not just a traffic offence, because this is one of those cases which is going to affect such a wide number of people. Like if we're talking about a theft or a murder or something like that, this is a tiny segment of population in the wider scheme of things. But a traffic offence affects lots of people. That might be their only experience of the justice system, and therefore, if they feel that they've been shut out of what they consider a just process, that can affect their relationship with the justice system more widely.
I guess there's been as well, like, some sort of automation, for example, with the speed cameras, right?
Absolutely.
So people already have this hatred towards the machines that take a photo if you're speeding, right? So I guess this is like one level extra of, this is another case of like people trying to fight like an algorithm rather than just a person, I guess.
Yeah. And also this is not new in law in the sense that often we feel injustices are done by a rule-based system. That doesn't necessarily have to be an algorithm. And what I'm really interested in is, where are those boundaries, and why are those boundaries occurring? Because I actually want to be able to use, what tools are right in the right circumstances. And so it's really interesting to try and engage with people and talk to them about why they see these boundaries and where they are. And part of my sort of visualizations and trying to show people is so that we can work out whether there are circumstances actually where AI or or just a simple algorithm, but which could prevent sort of a human decision maker from falling into some kind of logical fallacy where they think that certain bits of evidence add up to guilt, but they're not actually adding up to guilt. And, I can talk more about that, but, there's obviously problems in the justice system, which we would like to see if we can solve. We need to build this conversation with the public, to be able to have a shared kind of vocabulary and ability to talk about these things. And, that's partly why I've been involved in things outside of research and looking at art and various other methods. But it's just, we need to be able to have this conversation, because actually that's the justice system is so based around people understanding what's going on within it. It's not like an esoteric thing that's supposed to be just behind closed doors. This is a very different offering, and therefore, it's super important in these circumstances.
So you mentioned a bit about collaborating with artists there. So you did a bit of 3D environment modeling in this research. So how did you use that? I believe it was something around, prompting discussion around these legal issues. So I haven't looked up exactly what you did, but if I was to guess, is there some kind of way in the 3D environment where if you gave the sort of going through a red light when there's an ambulance coming scenario, is that the kind of scenarios that we're talking about, like sort of visually showing people?
Yeah, it's actually quite different to that, interestingly. So this is the Mercy project, which I've collaborated with Vivian Griffin, artist at Somerset House Studios. And the environment is a 3D environment, like you say. It's visually quite striking, and also has a soundscape designed by Vivian. And essentially what we use in that environment are metaphors to allow us to explain concepts within law and algorithms. And so I've used it in workshops, I've used it in teaching, but also in, sort of broader workshops. It's been exhibited in art gallery in Berlin as well, and in other places. essentially, you might see, you're going through corridors and things, and it's difficult to describe without showing it. But essentially, you start to gain a sense of decision tree algorithms, for example, through the structures, and then we can pause. If we're using it as a workshop, we can pause there and have a discussion about nature of these different algorithms. Within the environment is a kind of clue to a legal case, which I can, talk about. For example, it's a snail in a bottle, but it's, lawyers will know the case of Donoghue and Stevenson, but the name of the case is not relevant. What is relevant is how I can use it to explain how law has organically developed through a sense of injustice in certain circumstances. That's how we developed the law of negligence. There was no way to compensate this particular person who fell ill after there was a snail in this bottle. How much do we need to retain within a justice system the ability to have a human being register that there's something within the rules is not working and address it? So we're using, but at the moment it's very, as you say, as I'm saying, metaphorical rather than this kind of concrete description.
Is the snail in the bottle a metaphor itself, or is that some aspect of this particular case?
It was a snail in a bottle of ginger beer, so that was the case
right.
fact. But yeah, so it allows us to sort of go into these. There's rubbish within the it's a very austere environment, clean, but then there's this pile of human rubbish with sort of cigarette butts and things like that, and we can use that to sort of highlight the fact that human biases are replicated in data, that the various things we can have really insightful spring off conversations in an attempt to get people, and I'm not just saying the public here, it could be professionals, lawyers, judges, for example, to have these conversations, and in workshops it's worked really well. What I'd really like to do is to develop it further so that it wouldn't require me being present and talking about it, but it was integrated within the environment, that we can have further discussions.
I think people remember the metaphors and like the visual things that you create a lot more than if you just tell them. So it's if you have all of these like metaphors and all of these very visual things, people will remember. Maybe they wouldn't remember the data might have biases, but if you remember it as there was rubbish in a very clean environment, they will have like this image, I guess. So that's kind of how you end up having a more memorable in the audience than rather than
that sounds like a really interesting approach to doing it. I'm wondering, so like out of these workshops you run with this environment, like what are the sorts of things that the participants, firstly, who are the sort of workshop participants? You mentioned they might be judges, for example. What are the kind of ideas they come up with, or what's the insight they gain from this? Yeah,
I mean, I'm trying to arrange a judge workshop. This is, part of the plan. But the ones that I've done so far, might be students, for example, and they
the perfect guinea pigs.
Exactly. Often the first guinea pigs, but from different backgrounds, so people who don't know anything about, for example, data science or law necessarily, and having this conversation where they're seeing how these, this clear, as you said, the vision of rules. Therefore, let's make these a reality through code. It's not a smooth run. It's not impossible, but it's very, it's not easy, and therefore we need to, understand the nuances, work through them, and we need as many brains on the case, and as many viewpoints and different viewpoints on it as possible. Often there's sort of perception that, the public as a body don't agree with the idea of algorithms in justice or whatever. But I think that it's far more nuanced than that. And I think that there's, that I've spoken to justice campaigners who have said, well, actually, no, we want the consistency. We want the, we need some improvements in this area or that area. And I think it's a long road, but I think it's something that requires a lot of thought and work on, and a lot of involvement of the public, which is the key to understanding whether something is working or not.
I think consistency sounds like a key benefit, right? I mean, even if it's somehow, as you mentioned, some decision tree algorithm or something where, but because it is an algorithm, you're hoping that like the output from a given input is going to be the same or similar. So in this case, it will be the sort of the suggested penalty for whatever the crime is. And I'd imagine that in the reality of what we have at the moment of real world different judges and people, that there isn't that consistency always, because there is a certain amount of human judgment involved in interpreting the law.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's consistency has always been something that's been, something that's strived for within the law, historically, way before algorithms, or rather computer algorithms came on the scene. And but there's always been this push and pull, because, of course, we can't know every rule. We can't know every circumstance, especially in law. And there's also that real concern in law specifically that it will adapt with social expectations. And we know what might have seemed a perfectly acceptable rule, in one decade becomes completely abhorrent in another decade. And we need to be able to see how, to see that, but also, how does that mechanism work? Actually, sometimes it's the individual judges expressing concern or saying, well, this is not right, or juries might refuse to convict on a particular thing. So it's sort of looking into, okay, consistency is really important, because we want to know that, people will be treated more or less the same, in the sense of not different rules don't apply to different people. But
I mean, we hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we want. But we know that humans aren't able to achieve that, which is what you're referring to.
Yeah.
But I think the concern is maybe with an algorithm is that if it's going down the wrong road, then that applies to everybody. Whereas if one person goes down the wrong road, then maybe, I don't know if I explained myself very well, but you might have one bad apple, and essentially, if you use that phrase, somebody who's perhaps biased, and therefore making decisions that are not based on law. We can hope that in the sort of broader context that more people are doing it correctly, but we don't know that necessarily. So yeah, absolutely, we're looking to try and achieve some kind of consistency, but be flexible as to what and that's why discretion is often used as a kind of counter to consistency within the legal process, to allow that flexibility.
And how do you mean by discretion in this context?
Oh, well, discretion as in the ability, so having a range of possible actions. So you may have a flexibility in as to what exact sentence you give, or what weight you put onto a certain piece of evidence. That's kind of discretion, because that's a freedom for that individual to choose how much they do apply. So that's one of those areas where we say, well, there's a bit of leeway therefore to adjust compared on if you think that the strict application of rules is going to be in some
more
way
problematic than good. I have like an example of where that might be the case, and this is also where people might be skeptical of AI or any kind of algorithm making a decision, which is that we don't typically think of, like, it's difficult to program what we call, quote, common sense into computer programs. So I have an example, and it's not from lawyers or judges, but from the police. So there was an example, and this was a news story of it's not within the law to just open up like a food stall or a market anywhere, like on a residential street or something. And the news story was like some, a young girl was just like, selling lemonade outside a house, and a police officer came and told her to stop. And then of course the superiors of that police officer then disciplined that officer, saying, well, okay, that's what you've done there is you've applied the law in a very rigid way. You've not used your common sense. Like you shouldn't have told that girl that what she was doing was wrong. But if you're an AI, how can you know that? Like I mean, this human didn't know that, didn't have the common sense, but the AI definitely isn't going to have that kind of common sense. So I wonder if like within the law and within what you were just saying about discretion, this is where judges using their not just common sense but certainly their legal sense comes into play, and it's like, how can you really get that out of algorithms?
Yeah, and we've had a historical way in which we've kind of monitored that common sense, because of course we've often had judges that are of a different state, sort of social demographic than a lot of people being dealt with. Yeah. And that way in which common sense is monitored is often by open justice, right? So allowing people into court and allowing people to see those things. So, what you say is very, interesting and important, is how do we find the same mechanism in a way to ensure, or something that's equivalent to ensure, that if an algorithm is making a kind of decision, that there's a way in which it's open for people to see and call out if it's going beyond. And I don't think that should necessarily be left to an elite kind of group to do. And I think we need to look at how justice has worked historically. And this, it's always been people who have gone off, like you say, and used rules to the extreme, or not actually operated their common sense. We need to be aware of that same problem being magnified essentially with algorithms, because they simply they're not brought up as within the society necessarily, but they might be able to take data in. But as there's limitations, and we just have to be aware of how we do that. I think that is no other way than through testing and experimenting and checking, but doing so obviously with a real awareness that is human beings that are being essentially judged. And
so more research around algorithmic justice.
I have a question. I guess it's the other side of the coin, because now we are in a phase in our, in first time in humanity, where the judges have to judge an algorithm. So for example, a self-driving car, right? You have those cases, right, where how do you apply common sense to the decision of a self-driving car to actually, worst case scenario, drive over someone or something like that, right?
I guess the difference is that the self-driving car doesn't have any human rights. So if we decide that it needs to be destroyed,
But for example, who do you attribute the blame to? Is it the company that made the car? Is it the person that was in the car and didn't?
Yes.
So sorry, I guess it's the other side of the discussion, right? Which is, how do you now have the law evolving with the fact that you have to judge things that are not necessarily human decisions that were done?
Yeah, there's a temptation to kind of, think of them as human operators, isn't there? And attribute morality to them. I think that's probably could be a whole podcast in of itself. But I think that it's interesting, it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, and something that law schools need to grapple with as well, in terms of educating people ready to deal with the rapid evolution of technology in this field, and making sure that it's not enough just for lawyers to know the law anymore. They need to be able to be flexible, adaptable, and understand these technologies that are being used. There's always been certain lawyers that are interested in that kind of thing, but I think that's much broader now and something that needs to be looked at. But yeah, absolutely. Judged by your peers, should it just be judged by an algorithm? An
algorithm judging an algorithm.
Yeah.
Right. Could happen at some point. Wouldn't rule it out. And maybe a more general question then before we wrap up. I'm just wondering, like, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the sort of rate of change in technology and how that interfaces into the legal system? I think in general and sort of governments and regulations and stuff, there's a bit of a pessimism at the moment that, you know, it's just not possible for, you know, regulators of technology to really keep up with what's actually happening because it's so fast, and those people are not necessarily technologically literate, or even if they are, they're sort of playing catch up to, you know, the companies and the computer scientists and the AI specialists. So, you know, how do you feel with regard to the law?
Yeah, I don't feel pessimistic. I don't, but I think that you know, I actually feel like this is a challenge, an interesting new challenge, a new chapter, essentially. And I think that it's going to require real agility and change within what has been the legal sector, whether it's continues to be seen as like a sector in itself, or whether we need to adapt our ideas as to how law works in society more generally. That will remain to be seen. But I think that, you know, it's a challenge that's worth taking on and dealing with. Certainly don't feel pessimistic, but I think it requires a real focused effort to and a knowledge of what we're trying to achieve. And that's, I think, communication there, education and communication is going to be absolutely key. But I think that continuing to do things as we do at the moment is not going to work if you're talking about law and regulation. I mean, I also teach, you know, law and policy of fintech, and you know, there you see in a field where things have been always pushing the boundaries because, you know, financial, you know, money talks essentially. Whereas financial technologies, that's, you know, there's a real motivation then to innovate very quickly, and regulators come up with things like regulatory sandboxes, ways in which they can deal with a rapid evolution of technology. I mean, I think it just requires renewed efforts, but I think that it's not necessarily something to be pessimistic about.
I just have another question that's sort of prompted by what you said, actually. So I think what regulators do in finance is, like, now, and maybe this would be more difficult in the past, is, they just hire someone from the big banks who knows, you know, the stuff that they're going to be regulating. Is there a comparable thing that we can get in sort of in general in criminal law, but then who would no,
I think it's a bit of a frontier, really, in that sense, like, as in, like, we need to, because who are we doing it for? Whereas in fintech there's a motivator in a sense of trying to make money. There's an activity there. Here we really need to put front and center in you know, justice is whose interests are we working in, and what's the best way to administer justice. That's a story to be written, really, you know, something that we need to be working on. And that's why, you know, this constant iterative development of but with the inclusion of the public, I think is a good process to go through, because I mean, I don't think there's necessarily an easy, someone you can easily import into that process and go, hey, work this out. But I think there is a lot to be learned from different disciplines, a bit of lateral thinking, and looking how other people resolve our decision, you know, use decision making, resolve things, etc. But yeah, justice is a bit of a special case, I think. But you know, hence why we need to be really aware.
Some parallels, maybe B, you would agree with this, but what we're a bit more familiar with sort of the healthcare sector, in that there's obviously a lot more decision making going to be, you know, outsourced to computer programs, which makes sense. You know, we're obviously trying to figure out the right diagnosis and stuff for based on, and you know, research in healthcare is obviously going to be largely computational nowadays. So I can see. Oh, and what I was going to say, so the parallel there is, you know, consulting the public on how their healthcare data might be used that's a whole big thing now, and how the algorithms might be applied to that. So I think there's a parallel there.
There are. I mean, in the sense of decision making and having a consultation with people to see what it's like. But I think that you can't overlook that in law, really the process is part of like what we're trying to achieve. The actual process, why people often want their voice to be heard. They want to be, whether they're witness, accused or whatever, they want to have their moment of being heard. And what does that achieve? We still haven't fully bottomed that out, and we've never had to until now. We're looking at the point where you could automate this kind of decision making. So I think I'm not trying to downplay the similarity with medicine, because I think there is a really strong one, and something that we can really learn from. But just a slight nuance there that needs to be definitely plumbed out, I think.
And also in medicine, you have a lot more like a certain ground truth than you have in guilt, for example.
Yeah, that's true.
So in health, you can diagnose A or B, even if it's fuzzy. But as we said as you said early on, guilt is not necessarily something that is black or white.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's a big bit to end on.
we went full circle if you think about it.
Yeah. Well, Cari, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Before we let you go, where should people go to find out more about you and your research, if anywhere, online?
Well, first of all, huge thanks. It's been really interesting, and thank you for having me on. And so I do have what was formerly known as Twitter. I
will still continue.
Are we still? Yeah. So it's
it's still twitter.com, isn't it?
Yeah.
Depending on when _Hyde_V.
Depending on what point in the year, this should be released late 2023. This podcast, who knows what it will be called by then?
Absolutely,
we'll
it could be called Y by then.
Yeah. So mostly. So Twitter or X is my is where I often am seen. I do have a web page, but I feel like it'll be very long for me to explain it. So you might be able to put a link on the page.
We can do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. This was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, really such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. The show is hosted by me, B. Costa Gomez, Ed Kalstri, Joe Dungate, Christina Last, and Anika York. And the episodes are produced by Luca Lane. Music for this podcast is produced by Jam and Sun. You can listen and follow via the link in the description or by searching Jam and Sun on Instagram.